On the morning of September 11th, 2001, as Americans everywhere were shocked by the terror attack that would change the world, Lieutenant Heather Penney, callsign Lucky, was airborne in an unarmed F-16 Fighting Falcon over Washington D.C. The plan was simple. She and her wingman were going to sacrifice themselves to stop Flight 93 before it could find its target, the American capital. Heather Penney was born on Davis-Monthan Air Force Base near the tail end of the Vietnam War. Her father, Colonel John Penney, was a pilot with multiple combat missions at the stick of America's A-7 Corsair II under his belt. Penney grew up seeing her father in uniform and listening in as he and his friends told stories about their combat tours in Vietnam. In that environment, it might come as little surprise that she was drawn to aviation from an early age, especially the powerful new generation of fighters that were just beginning to emerge at the time. By the time she was 18, she already had her private pilot's license, but at the time, the U.S. didn't allow women in combat roles. She knew that no matter how good a pilot she was, following in her father's footsteps like she wanted just wasn't an option. So she enrolled at Purdue University and majored in literature, aiming for a career in education rather than one 30,000 feet above a combat zone. But just before she enrolled in graduate school, Congress reconsidered America's position on women in combat. And with bureaucracy no longer barring her from getting behind the stick of one of America's top-tier fighters, Penney headed straight for the local Air National Guard recruiting office. To quote Penney, "I signed up immediately. I wanted to be a fighter pilot like my dad." And Penney did take to the F-16 just like she knew she would, and before long, she was checking in at the 121st Fighter Squadron of the D.C. Air National Guard. She was the first female Viper pilot in the wing's history, and on the morning of Tuesday, September 11th, 2001, now First Lieutenant Penney reported to work, grabbing a seat around the briefing table. She was just coming back from 2 weeks of air combat training in Nevada, but in a very real way, she was still a rookie, without much experience in the supersonic fighter. And in fact, that morning, she wasn't scheduled to fly at all. The America that Penney and the rest of us lived in was different before 9/11. The Soviet Union had fallen a decade prior, and shortly after that, the US and its coalition allies had dominated the Iraqi military in the Gulf War. The threat from a rising China was still years away, and America found itself an unmatched power in a historically stable world. But that stability was going to be short-lived, because at 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11, which was a 160-foot-long Boeing 767 with 87 people on board, collided with the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. While today, in a post-9/11 world, there are always alert fighters on standby for just this sort of an attack, there were none on Andrews Air Force Base that morning. Of course, just about everyone was immediately aware of that first World Trade Center crash, but most of us at the time assumed it was nothing more than a tragic accident. In fact, some of the people on Andrews Air Force Base just assumed that it had been a small personal plane, like a Cessna 172, that had hit the building. But 17 minutes after the first aircraft hit the North Tower, another Boeing 767, this time United Airlines Flight 175, hit the South Tower. Most of the nation didn't know it yet, but the pilots at Andrews Air Force Base did as soon as they got word. America was at war, and we weren't even sure with who. At 9:37 a.m., a third hijacked aircraft, this time American Airlines Flight 77, crashed into the Pentagon, just 30 minutes from where Penney sat in the briefing room. Almost as soon as they had gotten word about that crash, more news came through the pipeline. There was another hijacked aircraft in the air, and it was headed for Washington, D.C. Now, Air Force personnel were springing into action all around the country, but despite their professionalism, confusion swelled within the ranks. Nobody had anticipated an attack like this, and shock was just part of the package. Penney may have been a rookie, but she knew that the hijacked aircraft would have to be intercepted and shot down before it could reach its target, which we now know was the Capitol building, but at the time could have been the White House or really any other target in the area. But every Fighting Falcon on the tarmac had been equipped with dummy rounds and fake munitions that were meant to mimic real ordnance for training. And it would take at least an hour to get the ammunition changed out and to have missiles mounted on the aircraft's hardpoints. I'm going to quote Penney here. "We know we have to get airborne. We know we have to protect. I was so eager, so impatient, and yet so frustrated and angry because we couldn't. As I said, we were with the D.C. Guard. We're not a part of the nation's alert squadron. Waiting an hour to rearm the F-16s just wasn't an option. The United States was under attack, and the men and women of Andrews Air Force Base may have been the only thing standing between the American capital and what was now a 250,000-pound missile full of innocent people heading straight for it. Penney was too junior in rank to do anything about that, but just then she caught the eye of Colonel Mark Sassville. Sass was scrambling to put on his flight suit. He had just gotten word from Vice President Dick Cheney to put fighters in the air and start searching for the hijacked airliner. When he made eye contact with the rookie pilot, he shouted, "Lucky, you're coming with me." It was just the opportunity she'd been waiting for, and she jumped at the opportunity to get into the fight. Penney took off behind Sass, running to their respective F-16s, but this junior pilot had never had to scramble a fighter in combat conditions before. And like any pilot, she deferred to her training, hurriedly beginning the checklist required to safely start an F-16 and get it ready to fly. I'll quote Sass again here. "Lucky, what are you doing? Get your butt up there and let's go." So Penney jumped in the cockpit, fired up the engines, and screamed to her ground crew to yank out the wheel chocks that were keeping it from rolling. As she began to taxi down the runway, her crew chief still had his headphones plugged into the fuselage so the two of them could talk. He was still pulling safety pins out of the F-16 as she began to taxi. By the time the crew chief unplugged, Sass was already in the air. Penney whispered a prayer to herself. "God, don't let me f*** this up," and followed right behind. It was only once both F-16s were airborne that the gravity of the situation really began to set in. Now on the hunt, Sassville and Penney began to form a plan. As they screamed over the smoldering Pentagon at 400 miles per hour, the senior pilot started to consider their options. He already knew that with no munitions on board, they were on a suicide mission. That part wasn't troubling him. It was the aerodynamic design of the target that gave him pause. I'm going to quote Sassville here. "We don't train to bring down airliners. If you just hit the engine, it could still glide and you could still guide it to a target. My thought was the cockpit or the wing." Now, just in case the nuance of that is lost to you, he means flying his F-16 straight into the cockpit or the wing. And while Sass will tell you that his plan was to eject just as his F-16 made contact, which would give him a small chance of surviving, Penney had been doing the same arithmetic in her head. But with the stakes so high, she calmly decided that saving her own life just wasn't as important as stopping the airliner from finding its target. She decided that she wouldn't even bother trying to eject. I'll quote Penney here. "I genuinely believed that it was going to be the last time I took off. If we did it right, this would be it." Both pilots scanned the skies for Flight 93, solemn in their determination to stop it from destroying America's capital, even if it cost their own lives. But despite their heroic efforts, it was a different group of heroes that would stop the 757 from making it to Washington. It was the passengers on board Flight 93 itself. Penney and Sassville may have been willing to give their lives to save others, but it was them that would ultimately make that sacrifice. Because as the two pilots were scouring the skies over Washington, D.C., the people on board that 757 were getting word of the other terrorist hijackings and the crashes into the World Trade Center in the Pentagon. In order to prevent their own flight from becoming another such attack, a group of passengers decided to retake the plane. A struggle ensued, and as the brave men and women of Flight 93 fought to retake their aircraft, the hijackers deliberately crashed it into the ground, killing everybody on board. The F-16 pilots continued their search, and they wouldn't know about the heroic last stand of the passengers of Flight 93 for hours to come. Later, Penney would say, and I quote, "The passengers in Flight 93 are the true heroes. In the years since that bright blue morning, I've come to realize that heroism isn't something unique or possessed only by a chosen few." Despite the tragedy of that day, Penney points out that Flight 93 stands as a shining example of what Americans will do to help one another, to save one another, when thrust into incredible circumstances. I'll quote Penney one more time. "I still get really frustrated with the failures of the command and control and all of that, but what I now see that gives me tremendous hope is that they were willing to do what was unimaginable and what they had no time to think of. When you take that oath of office, when you choose to enter the military, you use that time to sort of meditate on what that might require. They had to make that decision. Penney would go on to serve 2 combat tours in Iraq in the global war on terror that would follow, and continue her career in the Air National Guard. She also became the Director of Aviation Training Systems for Lockheed Martin, and today, she's a Senior Resident Fellow at the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies and a mom of 2 daughters. She finally hung up the uniform last year, but according to reports, she's still flying today. And that'll do it for this somber edition of Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure you swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and motivation from all around the force. If you got something out of this video, make sure to like and subscribe down below and leave me a comment to let me know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.